I longed with real intensity to gain new knowledge. At home, I had often thought it hard to spend my youth shut up in one place, and had wished to go out into the world and take my place among other people. Now, that wish had been granted, and it would have been foolish indeed to regret it. I had plenty of time on the long and tiring journey to Ingolstadt to turn these thoughts and many others over in my mind. At last, the tall white steeple of the town came into view. I got down from the carriage and was shown to my own quiet lodgings to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning, I delivered my letters of introduction and paid visits to several of the leading professors, among them M. Krempe, professor of natural philosophy. He received me politely and asked me a number of questions about what progress I had made in the various branches of natural science. I named, with some fear and hesitation, the only authors I had ever actually read on the subject. The professor stared at me. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time studying such nonsense?" I answered that I had. "Every minute," he went on, with real heat, "every single moment you have wasted on those books is entirely and completely lost. You have loaded your memory with discredited systems and useless names. Good God! In what wilderness have you been living that no one thought to tell you these fancies you have swallowed so eagerly are 1,000 years old and every bit as stale as they are ancient? I did not expect, in this enlightened and scientific age, to find a follower of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies again, entirely from the beginning." With that, he stepped aside and wrote out a list of books on natural philosophy that he wanted me to buy, then dismissed me, mentioning as I left that he would begin a course of lectures on natural philosophy the following week, and that his fellow professor, M. Waldman, would lecture on chemistry on the alternate days. I went home not at all disappointed, since I had long since decided for myself that the authors the professor had condemned were useless. But I felt little enthusiasm for the books he had recommended either. Monsieur Krempe was a short, thick-set man, with a rough voice and an unpleasant face, and nothing about him made me warm to his ideas. Besides, I had a real contempt for what modern natural philosophy seemed to have become. In the old days, when the masters of the science had reached for immortality and power, their goals, however useless, had at least been grand. Now the whole ambition of the field seemed to have shrunk down to tearing apart the very visions that had first drawn my interest to science at all. I was being asked to trade dreams of boundless grandeur for realities of very little worth. Such were my thoughts during the first 2 or 3 days, which I spent almost entirely alone. But when the following week began, I remembered what M. Krempe had told me about the lectures. I still could not bring myself to go and listen to that vain little man deliver his sentences from the podium, but I recalled what he had said about M. Waldman, whom I had not yet seen, since he had been out of town until then. Partly out of curiosity, and partly for lack of anything better to do, I went to the lecture hall, where M. Waldman appeared shortly after. This professor was nothing like his colleague. He seemed about 50 years old, with a face that expressed the greatest kindness. A few gray hairs touched his temples, though the hair at the back of his head was still nearly black. He was short in stature, but held himself remarkably upright, and his voice was the sweetest I had ever heard. He opened his lecture with a summary of the history of chemistry and the many advances made by different scholars over time, speaking with real warmth of the most distinguished names among them. He then gave a brief account of the current state of the science and explained a number of its basic terms. After running through a few preliminary experiments, he closed with a tribute to modern chemistry, in words I have never forgotten. "The ancient teachers of this science," he said, "promised the impossible and delivered nothing at all. The modern masters promise very little. They know metals cannot be transformed into gold, and that the elixir of life is a fantasy. And yet these same philosophers, whose hands seem made only for digging in the dirt, whose eyes seem fixed only on microscopes and crucibles, have in fact performed something like miracles. They reach into the hidden places of nature and show us how she works in secret. They rise into the very heavens. They have discovered how the blood moves through the body and what the air we breathe is truly made of. They have gained new powers, almost without limit. They can command the thunder of the sky, imitate the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with shadows of its own making." I left the lecture hall deeply pleased, both by the professor and by what he had said, and paid him a visit that same evening. In private, his manner was even gentler and more inviting than it had been in public. The dignity he carried while lecturing gave way in his own home to the greatest warmth and kindness. He listened closely to my brief account of my studies and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, though without the contempt Mr. Krempe had shown. "These were men," he said, "to whose tireless effort modern philosophers owe most of the foundations of their knowledge. They left us the easier task of giving new names to the facts they had, in large part, been the ones to bring to light in the first place. The labors of a man of genius, however wrongly aimed, hardly ever fail, in the end, to turn to the real benefit of mankind." I listened to all this, spoken without the slightest pride or affectation, and told him that his lecture had swept away my prejudice against modern chemists. I asked him, in turn, for his advice about which books I should get. "I am glad," said M. Waldman, "to have found a new student, and if your effort matches your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is the branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest advances have been made and can still be made. That is why I have made it my particular study. But I have not neglected the other branches of science either. A man would make a poor chemist if he confined himself to that one field of knowledge alone. If your wish is to become a true man of science and not merely a minor experimenter, I would advise you to apply yourself to every branch of natural philosophy, mathematics included." He then brought me into his laboratory and explained the use of his various instruments, telling me what I ought to buy and promising me the use of his own once I had advanced far enough in the science not to disturb their workings. He also gave me the list of books I had asked for, and I took my leave. That day proved to be one I would never forget. It decided the whole course of my future. From that day on, natural philosophy, and chemistry above all, taken in its widest sense, became almost my only occupation. I read with real passion the works so full of genius and insight that modern researchers had written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and got to know the men of science at the university, and I found even in M. Krempe a great deal of sound judgment and real knowledge, wrapped up, it is true, in an unpleasant face and manner, but no less valuable for that. In M. Waldman, I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tainted by any hint of dogma, and he taught with such openness and good humor that no trace of pedantry ever entered into it. It may have been the man's own warmth, rather than any deep love for the science itself, that first drew me toward the branch of philosophy he taught. But that was only true in the earliest steps of my learning. The more deeply I entered the science, the more I pursued it purely for its own sake. The discipline that had at first been a matter of duty and willpower soon became so eager, so consuming, that the stars would often fade into the light of morning while I was still at work in the laboratory. Given how closely I applied myself, it is easy to imagine how quickly I improved. My enthusiasm became something of a wonder among the students, and my skill among the professors. Professor Krempe would often ask me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Agrippa was getting on, while M. Waldman showed nothing but heartfelt joy at my progress. 2 years passed this way. I did not once visit Geneva, but stayed fully absorbed, heart and soul, in the pursuit of certain discoveries I hoped to make. No one who has not felt it can truly understand the pull of science. In other studies, you can only go as far as those before you have already gone, and then there is nothing left to learn. But in scientific inquiry, there is always more to discover, always more to wonder at. A mind of even ordinary ability, pursuing one subject closely enough, will eventually master it. And I, who thought of nothing else, wrapped up entirely in this one pursuit, advanced so quickly that by the end of 2 years, I had made certain improvements to some chemical instruments that earned me real admiration at the university. Once I had reached this point, and had learned as much of the theory and practice of natural philosophy as the professors at Ingolstadt had to teach, I began to think of returning home to my family and my native town, since staying longer no longer seemed likely to improve me further. But then something happened that kept me there. One phenomenon that had always drawn my particular attention was the structure of the human body, and indeed of any living creature. Where, I often asked myself, did the principle of life come from? It was a bold question, one that has always been treated as a mystery. And yet, how many things stand on the very edge of being understood, if only cowardice or carelessness did not hold back our inquiries? I turned these thoughts over in my mind, and resolved from then on to devote myself more particularly to the branches of natural philosophy connected to physiology. Without something like a supernatural enthusiasm driving me, this study would have been tedious, almost unbearable. To understand the causes of life, one must first turn to death. I became familiar with the science of anatomy, but that alone was not enough. I also had to observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. My father had taken great care in raising me to keep my mind free of any supernatural dread. I do not remember ever trembling at a tale of superstition or fearing the appearance of a ghost. Darkness held no power over my imagination, and a churchyard was, to me, nothing more than a resting place for bodies drained of life. Bodies that, having once been the seat of beauty and strength, had simply become food for worms. Now I was led to study the very cause and progress of that decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. I fixed my attention on things the most unbearable to ordinary human feeling. I watched the fine form of a man wear away and waste. I saw the corruption of death take the place of the bloom of life. I watched the worm inherit the wonders of the eye and the brain. I paused there, examining and breaking down every smallest detail of cause and effect in the change from life to death, and from death to life, until, out of the middle of that darkness, a sudden light broke over me. A light so brilliant, so astonishing, and yet so simple, that even as I grew dizzy with the vastness of what it revealed, I found myself amazed that among all the many brilliant minds who had turned their inquiries toward this same science, I alone should have been the one to uncover so extraordinary a secret. Remember, I am not recounting the vision of a madman. The sun does not shine in the heavens with any greater certainty than the truth of what I am telling you now. Some accident may have produced it, but the stages of the discovery itself were clear and reasoned, one following logically from the last. After days and nights of almost unbelievable labor and exhaustion, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and of life. More than that, I became capable myself of giving life to lifeless matter. The astonishment I felt at first over this discovery soon gave way to delight, to something like rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor, to arrive all at once at the very summit of everything I had wanted was the most satisfying end my efforts could possibly have reached. But the discovery itself was so vast, so overwhelming, that all the individual steps that had led me to it seemed to vanish, and I saw only the result. What had been the study and the longing of the wisest men since the beginning of the world now lay within my grasp. Not that it all opened before me at once, like some scene of magic. The knowledge I had gained was more a guide for where to direct my efforts once I turned them toward my goal, than a picture of that goal already achieved. I was like the man in the old Arabian tale, buried alive among the dead, who finds his way back to life, guided by nothing more than one faint, uncertain light. I can see by your eagerness, my friend, by the wonder and hope written on your face, that you expect me to tell you the secret I discovered. That cannot be. Listen patiently to the end of my story, and you will understand well enough why I keep silent on that point. I will not lead you on, unguarded and full of ambition as I once was, toward your own ruin and certain misery. Learn from me, if not from what I say, then at least from what I have lived through, how dangerous the pursuit of knowledge can be, and how much happier the man is who believes his own small town to be the whole world, than the one who reaches to become greater than his nature allows. Once I found such an astonishing power placed in my hands, I hesitated a long time over how I should use it. Although I now possessed the ability to bring matter to life, preparing a body to receive that life, with all its intricate fibers, muscles, and veins, remained a task of almost unimaginable difficulty. I considered at first whether to attempt a being like myself, or one of simpler construction, but my imagination had been so lifted by my first success that I could not doubt my ability to give life to something as complex and remarkable as a human being. The materials I had on hand hardly seemed equal to so difficult a task, but I had no doubt that I would succeed in the end. I prepared myself for repeated setbacks. My efforts might be endlessly frustrated, and the final result might be imperfect. But when I considered the progress being made every day in science and mechanics, I felt encouraged to believe that even my present attempt might lay the foundation for future success. Nor did the sheer scale and complexity of my plan strike me as any argument against its being possible. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. Since the smallness of the individual parts made my work painfully slow, I decided, against my first plan, to make the creature of a gigantic size, about 8 feet in height and built in proportion. Having settled on this, and having spent several months successfully gathering and arranging my materials, I began. No one can imagine the whirl of feeling that carried me forward like a storm in that first rush of success. Life and death seemed to me nothing more than ideal boundaries, which I would be the first to break through, pouring a flood of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator, its source. Many happy, excellent beings would owe their very existence to me. No father could ever claim the gratitude of his child as completely as I would deserve theirs. Following this line of thought, I imagined that if I could give life to lifeless matter, I might one day, though I found it impossible for the moment, restore life to a body that death had already claimed for decay. These thoughts kept my spirits up as I pursued my work with unrelenting energy. My face grew pale with study, and my body grew thin from being shut away so long. Sometimes, right on the edge of success, I failed, and yet I clung always to the hope that the next day or the next hour might bring it. The one secret I alone possessed was the very hope to which I had given myself entirely, and the moon looked down on my midnight labors, as with a restless, breathless eagerness I chased nature into her most hidden places. Who could imagine the horror of my secret work as I dug among the unholy dampness of the grave, or tormented the living creature to bring life to lifeless clay? My hands tremble even now, and my eyes swim at the memory of it. But at the time, a force I could not resist, something close to madness, drove me forward. I seemed to have lost every part of my soul and my senses, except for this one pursuit. It was, in truth, only a passing trance, one whose effects I felt all the more sharply once the strange energy behind it faded, and I returned to my ordinary self. I gathered bones from charnel houses, and disturbed, with unholy hands, the tremendous secrets of the human body. In a solitary chamber, a cell really, at the top of the house, cut off from every other room by a gallery and a staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyes seemed to start from their sockets as I bent over the details of my work. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse supplied much of my material, and again, my own human nature recoiled in disgust from what I was doing, even as an ever-growing eagerness drove me on toward finishing it. The summer months passed while I remained absorbed, heart and soul, in this single pursuit. It was a beautiful season. The fields never gave a richer harvest, nor the vines a fuller vintage, but my eyes were blind to the beauty around me. The same feelings that made me overlook the world outside my window also led me to forget the friends I had not seen in so long, so many miles away. I knew my silence troubled them, and I remembered well enough my father's words. I know that so long as you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we will hear from you regularly. You must forgive me if I take any break in your letters as a sign that your other duties are being just as neglected. I knew well enough then what my father must be feeling, but I could not tear my thoughts away from my work. Loathsome as it was in itself, it had taken an unbreakable hold over my imagination. I wanted, in a sense, to put off everything to do with affection and feeling until the great goal that had swallowed up every other part of my nature was finally complete. I believed then that my father would be unfair to blame my neglect on any fault of mine. I am convinced now that he was right to think I bore at least some of the blame. A person in a state of true balance ought always to keep a calm and peaceful mind, and never let passion or some passing desire disturb that peace. I do not think the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study you devote yourself to weakens your affections and destroys your taste for the simple pleasures that no ambition can ever corrupt, then that study is not a fit one. It does not suit the human mind. If this rule were always followed, if no man ever let any pursuit interfere with the peace of his family affections, Greece would never have fallen into slavery. Caesar would have spared his own country. America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru would never have been destroyed.
But I am moralizing at the very heart of my story, and your look reminds me to go on. My father made no reproach in his letters. He only noted my silence by asking, more closely than before, what I was doing with myself. Winter, spring, and summer passed while I labored on, and I did not once watch for the blossoms or the unfolding leaves, sights that had always given me the greatest joy before. So completely was I lost in my work. The leaves of that year had already withered by the time my work drew near its end, and every day now showed me more clearly how well I had succeeded. But my excitement was checked by anxiety, and I came to resemble less an artist absorbed in his favorite work than someone condemned to labor in the mines or in some other unhealthy trade. Every night a slow fever weighed on me, and my nerves grew painfully raw, a condition I regretted all the more since I had always, until then, enjoyed excellent health and had always been proud of how steady my nerves were. But I believed that exercise and some amusement would soon chase these symptoms away, and I promised myself both once my creation was complete.